The morning sun rose over the Arizona plains like a molten coin, glinting off the dust and heat that wrapped the small frontier town of Red Mesa. The day promised celebration, the annual town fair, a day of music, contests, and the arrival of traders from all around the territory. Colorful bunting stretched from building to building, and the air was thick with the smell of roasting corn and horses out among the early crowd. Clara Mae Thompson stepped down from the wagon that had carried her in from her family's ranch 6 miles away. She paused, straightened her dress, and smoothed the wrinkles that refused to lie flat. It was a pale blue cotton dress, once her mother's, which she had stitched and mended more times than she could count. Her hands were clever but rough from ranch work. The needle had pricked them often. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She'd only come to sell her jars of honey and a few loaves of cornbread, hoping to earn enough to buy flour and sugar for the coming winter. Still, deep down, there was a flicker of hope that today might be different, that she might walk through town and not feel invisible or looked down upon for her family's poverty. The square was already crowded with people. Children darted between wagons, women clustered around the pie stalls, and men gathered near the shooting range. Clara found a small corner for her basket of goods and began arranging her jars, pretending not to notice the curious looks that followed her. She was used to them. In a place where everyone's worth was measured by their land and clothes, her worn shoes and calloused hands spoke louder than her soft voice ever could as the sun climbed higher. A gust of wind swept through the square, catching the loose edge of her skirt. Clara bent quickly to gather it, but her boot caught on a nail sticking out of the wooden platform. There was a sharp rip, and she felt the cold touch of air against her leg as the hem of her dress tore open halfway to the knee. For a heartbeat, silence hung. Then came the laughter. It started with a sharp snicker from one of the merchant's wives, then spread like wildfire. 2 young women near the ribbon stall giggled behind their gloved hands. A heavy-set man chuckled openly, elbowing his friend. Even some of the children pointed, their high laughter piercing the air. Clara froze. Her face flushed a deep scarlet as she clutched at the torn fabric, trying to pull it together. She could feel every eye on her, measuring, mocking, judging. The laughter wasn't cruel in volume, but in tone it carried that smug amusement that said she didn't belong here, that no matter how hard she tried, she would always be poor Clara Mae from the Thompson Ranch, the girl with patched dresses and dirt beneath her nails. Her fingers trembled as she knelt, fumbling to fix the tear. But the more she tried to gather the cloth, the worse it looked. Her pride, already thin from years of whispers and pity, felt like it was unraveling with every giggle from the crowd. A man in a fine waistcoat shook his head, smirking. "Reckon some folks shouldn't come to town looking like beggars," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. The women around him tittered. Clara's throat burned. She wanted to disappear, to be swallowed by the dust under her boots. She had never cared much for the townsfolk's approval, but standing there, surrounded by laughter, something inside her broke. She thought of her mother's words, spoken long ago before sickness took her. "Hold your head high, Clara Mae. A woman's worth isn't in her dress." But right now, those words felt far away, drowned in the cruelty of the moment. She straightened up, blinking back tears, clutching her torn dress in one hand. She wanted to walk away, but her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Around her, the laughter was fading into murmurs, but the damage was done. Her pride lay in tatters as visible as the cloth in her hand. Somewhere beyond the circle of townspeople, a tall, quiet figure watched. A man with bronze skin and dark braids that caught the sun. His expression was unreadable, his posture calm. He was an Apache scout, known to some, feared by others. His name was Taza. Though few dared speak it aloud, he had seen mockery before seeing what fear and smallness did to people's hearts. But as he watched the young woman struggling to hold together her dignity amid a sea of smirks, something in his chest stirred, Clara didn't see him then, not yet. Her eyes were on the ground, her breath shaking. But soon the sound of boots on dry earth would break the silence again, not with laughter this time, but with the quiet strength of honor. And in that moment, everything would change. The laughter died slowly, not because anyone had found their conscience, but because something had shifted in the air, an unease that people could feel before they understood. At the edge of the square, a man stood motionless. Taza, an Apache warrior turned army scout, was accustomed to standing apart. He leaned against the hitching post near the blacksmith's forge, his broad shoulders still beneath the weight of his cavalry-issued coat, the dark wool stitched at the cuffs with thin rows of blue and white beads marks of his people's craft, woven into the uniform of his conquerors. He was a man who belonged nowhere completely. To the settlers, he was a reminder of the land before fences and maps, a presence that made them uneasy even as they relied on his skill to guide them through Apache territory. To his own kin, those who still roamed the mesas and hidden canyons, he was a man who had strayed too close to the enemy. He'd grown used to that silence, used to being both needed and mistrusted. It sat on him like a second skin. But now, as he watched the girl in the torn blue dress standing alone amid the laughter, something cut through that silence. It was not pity. It was recognition. He had seen that look before, the wide eyes that refused to let tears fall, the way the shoulders squared even as shame burned the face. It was the look of someone trying to hold their ground when the world was laughing at them. The girl's name, he recalled, was Clara Mae Thompson. He had heard the storekeeper mention her once when she came to trade honey, speaking in that half-condescending tone people used when describing someone who worked hard but didn't belong. Taza's dark eyes lingered on her a moment longer. Her hands trembled as she clutched her torn dress, but there was defiance in her chin. It reminded him of the young women in his village long ago, those who carried water through the canyons while soldiers patrolled nearby. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refused to bow. Around him, he could feel the shifting stares. A few men noticed him now, murmuring under their breath. Even here, far from the reservation line, an Apache in uniform was a sight that never failed to stir whispers. The blacksmith, a heavy man with soot on his cheeks, muttered, "Ain't right, letting them savages wear the coat." His words weren't loud, but they carried. Taza's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He had learned long ago that words were wind. They only cut if you gave them your breath in return. Still, he couldn't take his eyes off Clara Mae. Her humiliation sat heavy in the square, like dust that refused to settle. When the wind picked up again, it lifted the torn edge of her skirt, and she bent to hold it down again, quietly, desperately. That single motion, so small, so human, was what broke something inside him. He straightened from the hitching post and began to walk forward. His steps were deliberate, unhurried. The sound of his boots on the dry ground echoed faintly through the murmuring crowd. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The sheriff, standing near the pie stall, noticed him and frowned, adjusting his belt. "Now hold on there, Taza," he said cautiously, his voice carrying the unease of a man who wanted to sound in control. "Ain't no need to," but Taza kept walking. Clara Mae looked up just as his shadow fell across her. For a second, her heart stumbled. She knew of him, the Apache scout who worked for the fort, the man most folks spoke of in the same breath as danger. Up close, he was taller than she had expected, his face calm but unreadable, carved by sun and wind. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, not fear, not curiosity, but a quiet understanding that neither could have named. Taza looked down at her torn dress, then at the faces around them, faces that still held that awkward, self-conscious guilt that comes after cruelty. His gaze was sharp, not angry but clear, and under it, people began to fidget. He didn't speak. Instead, he slowly unbuttoned his dark army coat. The wool was sun-faded at the shoulders, the brass buttons dulled from years of wear. He lifted it from his shoulders and, with a movement both gentle and sure, draped it over Clara's. The murmurs around them turned to stunned silence. The bright blue of her torn cotton disappeared beneath the dark coat, the sleeves hanging past her wrists. Taza's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "No one should stand in the wind alone," he said, his English careful but strong. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. He gave a small nod, nothing more, and stepped back once. Standing beside her now instead of across from her Dot, no one laughed. No one dared. The sheriff shifted uneasily. The merchant looked down at his boots, and the women who had giggled before now stared at their hands. In that moment, it wasn't the coat that covered her. It was the quiet dignity of a man who had known scorn all his life and chose, instead of anger, compassion. And as the dust settled around them, something in the air changed forever. The town square had gone still, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. The sun, which only moments ago had seemed too bright and cruel, now hung high and silent above a crowd unsure of itself. The laughter had drained away, leaving behind only the soft rustle of skirts, the creak of a wagon wheel, and the distant whistle of wind over the rooftops. Clara May stood at the center of it all, swallowed in the heavy folds of Taza's coat. The wool was coarse and warm against her skin, carrying the faint scent of smoke and cedar. It was far too big for her slender frame. The sleeves fell past her wrists, and the hem brushed against her ankles, but somehow it made her feel steadier, as though she had been wrapped not in fabric, but in quiet strength. Her eyes lifted from the dust to meet his. For a long, fragile moment, neither of them spoke. Taza's gaze held hers, deep, dark, and unwavering. There was no pity in it, no condescension, only calm respect, the kind that came from someone who understood what it meant to be mocked, to be measured against the world and found wanting simply for who you were around them. The crowd was beginning to stir again, uncertain how to reclaim the easy cruelty they had just lost. A woman near the milliner's booth murmured something about drama and turned away. The sheriff cleared his throat but said nothing. A few children stared wide-eyed, sensing instinctively that something had happened that grown-ups didn't know how to explain. Clara swallowed hard. Her voice felt trapped in her chest. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Taza's expression didn't change. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." His English was accented but precise, every word deliberate. The simplicity of his answer left no space for argument, for a heartbeat. Clara didn't know where to look. His coat around her shoulders felt both protective and intimate, and she could sense the heat of judgment pressing in from every direction. But then something in her steadied. Her hands unclenched at her sides. She took a breath that no longer trembled. "I should go," she murmured, glancing at the basket she had left by the stall, her jars of honey still untouched. "I think I've sold enough for one day." Taza nodded once, the faintest hint of something softer crossing his features. Then he stepped slightly to the side and, without asking, extended his arm, an old gesture, half forgotten from another world. The meaning was clear. He would walk with her. For a second, Clara hesitated. She could feel the eyes still following them, the disapproving stares, the quiet shock of a town that prided itself on civility but had just been shown its own cruelty. But then she saw something else in his stillness, not defiance, but dignity, and so she placed her hand on his offered arm. Together, they began to walk across the square. The sound of their steps, the soft tread of worn boots and moccasins, seemed to echo louder than the music that had once played from the bandstand. The crowd parted without words, leaving a narrow path between the stalls. No one dared to speak. As they passed, Clara kept her eyes forward, refusing to shrink. The warmth of his coat gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. Every step away from the laughter felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen piece by piece. When they reached the edge of the square, she exhaled, her shoulders loosening. The air outside the crowd felt cleaner, lighter. She turned to Taza, her lips parting to speak, but for a moment she couldn't find the words. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but steady. Taza looked out toward the line of the desert hills, where the horizon shimmered like fire. "Because they forgot what honor looks like," he said. "And you remembered." Clara frowned softly. "Remembered?" He glanced at her, a trace of warmth in his eyes. "You stood tall when they laughed. That is the way of strength." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, her throat thick. The two of them stood there for a moment longer, surrounded by the wide silence of the desert wind. Behind them, the fair began to stir again, music returning, chatter rising, but something had shifted. People looked differently now at the space where the laughter had died. Clara reached up to pull the coat a little tighter around her shoulders. "I'll have it cleaned and returned," she said softly. Taza gave a faint smile. "When the wind forgets your name," he replied, which she took as a kind of "don't bother." And with that, he turned and walked toward the hitching post where his horse waited, the sunlight catching on the beadwork of his shirt. Clara watched him go, the coat heavy with warmth and meaning around her shoulders. For the first time that day, she smiled not from relief but from understanding. He hadn't just covered her. He had restored her. By late afternoon, the fair had regained its sound music, chatter, the rattle of wagon wheels, but not its ease. The laughter that once filled Red Mesa Square had left something behind, a quiet weight that people felt but didn't speak of. The story of the girl in the torn blue dress and the Apache who covered her was already beginning to drift from lip to lip, reshaped with every telling. Clara May, meanwhile, lingered by the road that led out of town, her basket of honey jars light in her hands. The coat still rested on her shoulders, far too large and far too fine for her. She had half a mind to return it immediately, but another part of her, the part that was tired of always apologizing, told her to wear it a little longer. The wind was cooler now, tinged with the scent of sage. The fair's music carried faintly behind her, distant and thin. She found him by the corral behind the livery stable. Taza was tending to his horse, a chestnut mare with a white blaze across her muzzle. His movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial. He brushed the mare's coat with slow, rhythmic strokes, speaking to her in a language Clara didn't understand. The words were low and fluid, filled with something softer than the rough English she'd heard from most men. For a moment, Clara hesitated. She wasn't sure how to approach him, whether to speak or simply leave the coat folded over the fence and go. But as if sensing her, Taza turned. He looked at her the same way he had before, directly, without judgment, without surprise. "I wanted to return your coat," Clara said, her voice uncertain. I can't keep it." He studied her quietly. "Did it keep you warm?" She blinked. "Yes." "It did. Then it did its work," he said. "A coat that warms one heart can warm another. That is enough." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Still, it's yours. You need it." Taza tilted his head slightly, the faintest glimmer of a smile touching his lips. "I have many coats," he said, "but only one was made with respect. That one belongs where it was given." She looked down, unsure what to say. The coat hung around her like a shield, its weight steadying her even as she argued to give it back. "You embarrassed them," she said after a pause, her tone half wonder, half worry. "The townsfolk. They won't forget that." "They should not," he replied evenly. "They forgot how to see." Clara frowned. "To see what?" "Each other." He spoke the words with such simple certainty that she felt them settle in her chest. It wasn't just kindness that had moved him, it was conviction. In that instant, she understood that his gesture in the square hadn't been for show or for her alone. It had been a mirror held up to the town itself. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured again. Taza met her gaze. "When the wind breaks a branch, another must bend to shelter it. That is how the tree survives." She had never heard words like his before, so plain, yet so full of meaning. She wanted to ask him more, but instead, she found herself simply standing there, caught in a silence that wasn't awkward, but alive. Behind them, a few townsfolk passed on their way to the saloon. Their eyes flickered between her and Taza, curious, uncertain, but they said nothing. The same men who had laughed earlier now walked past in uneasy quiet, the boldness gone from their steps. It struck Clara then that no one had apologized to her. No one had offered a word or a glance of remorse. Yet somehow, the weight of shame had shifted from her to them. Taza gave a soft whistle, and his horse flicked her tail. "You are brave," he said, almost as if to himself. Clara's brow furrowed. "I didn't do anything." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the faintest trace of warmth in his expression, a human softness beneath the stoic calm. "You stood," he said simply. "When the wind pushed, you did not fall. That is what brave means." Her chest tightened again, not with sorrow this time, but something gentler. "Will you be at the fair tomorrow?" she asked, surprising herself. He nodded once. "The army has business with the trader. I will be here." She gave a small, nervous smile. "Then I'll bring your coat back anyway, cleaned like I said." Taza's eyes softened. "If you wish," he said, "but maybe it will fit better tomorrow." And with that, he turned back to his horse. The conversation ended as naturally as a sunset. Clara stood there for a long time, her heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. She touched the edge of the coat, tracing the beadwork at the cuff, blue, white, and gold threads woven into a pattern of waves. It was, she realized, more than a coat. It was a promise of dignity, of worth, of being seen. As the last of the day's light spilled across the desert, she walked home slowly, the weight of his gesture still around her shoulders, and though she could still hear faint laughter from the saloon, it no longer sounded like it was meant for her. That night, Red Mesa slept uneasily. The fair still carried on until dusk, children chasing ribbons through the dust, fiddlers playing on the porch of the saloon, but beneath the laughter ran a quiet current of discomfort. It was the kind of silence people kept when they were trying not to think about something they'd done. Everywhere Clara May's name lingered. The story spread faster than wildfire in dry grass, carried by whispers and half-truths. Some said the Apache had taken pity on a poor ranch girl. Others said he had shamed the whole town on purpose. By morning, the story would twist again, each retelling colored by guilt, pride, or prejudice. But for the first time, it wasn't Clara who was being laughed at. The next morning, she walked through town again, basket in hand, wearing the same patched blue dress, but with Taza's coat folded neatly over her arm. She could feel eyes on her as she passed. The baker who had laughed, now suddenly very busy arranging loaves in his window. The sheriff who tipped his hat too quickly, as if trying to erase yesterday's silence. She said nothing. She simply walked on, the sun glinting off the brass buttons of the coat she carried. It felt strange to be noticed in a different way, stranger still to feel neither fear nor shame. At the far end of the square, near the trading post, she saw Taza again. He was speaking with a soldier from the fort, their voices low. His horse waited behind him, its reins looped around a post. The soldier, a lean man in a dusty blue coat, spotted Clara first. His expression shifted, confusion flashing across his face as he recognized her. He muttered something to Taza, who turned. Their eyes met once more, and the noise of the square seemed to fade around her. She approached. holding the coat out carefully. "I cleaned it," she said softly, "like I promised." Taza regarded her for a moment, then shook his head. "It belongs to you now. I can't take something that isn't mine." His lips curved in the faintest smile. "You already took back what was yours, your pride. The coat was only to help you find it." Before she could reply, a familiar voice rang out across the square. "Well, look who's found herself a new friend." Clara turned. It was Samuel Pratt, the merchant who'd laughed the loudest the day before. He stood with two other men by his stall, their expressions smug and uncertain all at once. "Didn't think the army let Indians hand out uniforms to just anyone," he added. Loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, a few others turned to look store clerks. Ranch hands, a woman clutching her child's hand. For a heartbeat, the air tensed again. Taza's expression didn't change. He stood straight and still, his dark eyes fixed on Pratt. "Say what you mean," he said quietly. Pratt hesitated. "I mean well. Folks talk, that's all. Don't see why a man like you needs to get involved in indecency." Taza finished for him. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "A woman fell. You laughed. I gave her my coat. The rest is in your heart, not mine." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the townsfolk shifted uneasily. Pratt's cheeks reddened, but he forced a laugh. "You've got a smart tongue for a—" "Enough," the sheriff interrupted, his voice low but firm. He stepped between them, his eyes flicking nervously from Taza to the merchant. "Let's not stir more trouble. The man did no harm. But the damage was already done, though not to Taza. The crowd had changed. The same people who had stood idly by yesterday were now staring at Pratt, not with amusement, but discomfort. They saw now, with painful clarity, what their laughter had looked like, how small. It seemed beside the quiet dignity of the Apache and the courage of the girl they'd mocked. Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke more than their words ever could. After a long moment, Pratt muttered something under his breath and turned away, his pride wounded more deeply than he understood. The crowd began to drift, whispering, but this time, the whispers weren't about her. Taza turned back to Clara. "The wind has changed," he said softly. She nodded. "Yes, I can feel it." He studied her for a moment longer, then inclined his head. "You carry the coat well," he said, and began to walk toward his horse. Clara looked down at the garment in her arms. The morning light shimmered on its beadwork, the patterns glinting like tiny flames. Around her, people were watching, but not one dared laugh. For the first time since her mother's passing, she felt something powerful rise in her chest, not defiance, but peace. She realized then that Taza's gesture had done more than shield her from shame. It had forced the town to see itself, and that was a wound far deeper than a torn dress. The morning after the confrontation in the square, Red Mesa felt different. The fairgrounds had emptied, leaving behind trampled dust and scraps of colored ribbon fluttering in the wind. The bunting over the saloon sagged, and the music stand was quiet now, its fiddles and laughter carried away with the last wagons heading toward Tucson. For Clara May, the silence was a relief. She had never cared much for crowds. She liked the stillness of the open land, the way sound traveled differently beyond the town, less like noise, more like memory. She was standing by the edge of the road, her basket empty, when she saw Taza again. He was walking toward the creek that cut through the southern edge of town, leading his horse by the reins. He moved with that same quiet grace she'd noticed before, like someone who had learned long ago to measure his steps in a world that was not his. She hesitated for only a moment, then called out softly, "Taza." He stopped and turned. The sun was bright behind him, casting his figure in gold and shadow. "I wanted to thank you again," she said as she approached. "For yesterday, for everything." He regarded her for a moment, then nodded. You already did. I know, she said with a small, nervous laugh. But I thought maybe I'd say it where people weren't listening this time. That drew the faintest hint of a smile from him. Better words travel on quiet wind, he said. They began to walk together without deciding to side by side along the dusty trail that followed the creek. The land stretched out wide and sunlit before them, the air humming with the distant chirr of cicadas. For a long while they said nothing. The silence between them wasn't heavy, though. It felt like the kind that grows between two people who understand something without needing to explain it. Finally, Clara asked, Do you ever get tired of people staring at you? Taz's mouth curved slightly. No more than you? She blinked, caught off guard. Me? You walk through this town like someone who doesn't ask for permission, he said. They notice that. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. If only that were true. I've spent most of my life wishing people wouldn't notice me at all. Taza looked out across the horizon, his voice thoughtful. My people say a coyote will hide from the sun only when it forgets it has teeth. The world notices strength. Sometimes it mistakes it for defiance. She thought about that for a while as they walked. She'd never been called strong before, stubborn, maybe, or proud, but not strong. The words settled in her chest like a small, glowing ember dot. The trail led them to a bend in the creek where the water ran clear and cool. Clara stopped there, kneeling to let her fingers trail through the surface. The heat of the day melted away in the soft current. Do you miss it? She asked suddenly, looking up at him. Your home. Your people. Taz's gaze softened. Every day, he said. But missing is not always sorrow. Sometimes it is the way we keep what we love alive. She nodded slowly. I think I understand that. They sat by the water a while longer, saying little. A hawk circled high above them, its shadow gliding across the sand. The wind moved through the mesquite trees with a sound like breathing. When Clara finally rose, the sun had begun to sink toward the hills, painting the sky in soft bands of rose and amber. She brushed the dust from her skirt and glanced at him. I suppose I should be heading home before it gets dark, she said. Taza inclined his head. I will walk you. You don't have to. I know, he said simply. They followed the dirt road west, toward the wide stretch of land that rolled out to the Thompson Ranch. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was still clear. Clara found herself stealing glances at him as they walked, curious about the quiet power that seemed to follow him like a shadow. When they reached the split in the road where she would turn off toward home, she stopped. You'll be at the fort again tomorrow? Yes, he said. But the road between here and there is long. It crosses the same sky. She smiled faintly. That sounds like a poetic way of saying maybe. Maybe, he echoed. They stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to leave. Then, with a soft nod, he turned his horse toward the trail. Clara watched until he disappeared behind a rise of a hill, the fading light catching the beadwork at his collar like sparks dot as she walked the last stretch home. The desert around her seemed different, less empty, more alive. The same wind that once carried laughter now brushed gently through her hair, that it carried something else. Too something unspoken but certain. Not an ending, she realized, but the beginning of a story neither of them had planned to write. By the end of that week, Red Mesa had begun to change slowly, quietly, like a river carving new lines through stubborn stone. The story of what happened in the square had spread beyond the town. Traders carried it to neighboring settlements, adding color and shape as gossip always does. Some told it as a scandal, an Apache shaming the good people of Red Mesa. Others spoke of it as a tale of courage, of a man who'd reminded them all what honor meant. Either way, no one who heard it could forget the image of a warrior draping his coat over a young woman's torn dress while a crowd fell silent in Red Mesa itself. The change was small at first. The merchant Samuel Pratt, who once laughed the loudest, now nodded stiffly when Clara passed his shop. The blacksmith began buying her honey for his morning tea, pretending it was just good business. Even the sheriff, who used to look past her like she was part of the dust, started tipping his hat when she walked by. No one mentioned the torn dress anymore. It was as though the wind had carried that shame away and left something gentler in its place. Clara, for her part, didn't seek attention. She simply kept living her quiet life, tending to her family's few cattle, baking bread, gathering wildflowers for her table. But something inside her had shifted. The small, steady fire Taza had kindled in her the day he placed his coat over her shoulders had not gone out. It glowed in the way she walked now, with her head high, her eyes clear, her words no longer whispered. Sometimes, when she stood at the edge of the field at dusk, she would look toward the distant hills where the fort lay hidden beyond the sagebrush. She didn't know if Taza was there, but the thought of him carried a kind of peace that surprised her. One afternoon, about a week later, a rider appeared on the trail leading toward her ranch. Clara shaded her eyes against the sun, and her heart caught in her throat when she saw who it was. Taza rode easily, his back straight, his coat now replaced by a woven blanket of deep red and black. His horse's hooves kicked up a slow trail of dust as he approached the fence line. "You came back," Clara said, smiling despite herself. Taza dismounted with quiet grace. "The fort sent me to deliver messages to the sheriff," he said. Then, after a pause, "But I wanted to see if the wind still carried your name." She laughed softly. "It does, though it carries yours too, I think." He looked out over the wide, empty fields. "The town treats you differently now." "Yes," she said. "They look me in the eye." "That is good," he said, but his voice carried a weight behind it. Clara tilted her head. "You sound like it isn't." Taza hesitated, then spoke. "Sometimes people look at what they don't understand, not to know it, but to remind themselves it is strange." She thought about that for a moment, then smiled gently. "Maybe, but some of them look with kindness now, and maybe that's a start." He gave a small nod, as though conceding the point. They walked along the fence line together, the sky burning gold and violet as the sun began to sink. The world around them was hushed except for the distant cry of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the grass. "Will you stay long?" she asked. "Only tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, I ride north with the patrol." Clara felt a pang she couldn't quite name. "That sounds dangerous." Taza's eyes softened. "Every road is dangerous when it leads away from home." They stopped near the old cottonwood tree by the creek, the same one where her father used to tie his horse when he came in from work. The branches above them swayed, scattering golden leaves that drifted down like soft rain. "I never thanked you properly," Clara said quietly, "for what you did that day. You didn't just help me, you changed everything." Taza shook his head. "You changed it yourself. I only reminded them to see." She smiled, her eyes glimmering in the fading light. "Still, I'm glad you were there." He looked at her for a long moment, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them, something both fragile and certain. As dusk deepened, Taza reached into his saddlebag and drew out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her. She unfolded it carefully to find a necklace of turquoise and bone beads strung on a thin strip of leather. "It is called Nad Ajo," he said. "It means heart that endures. My mother made it long ago." Clara touched the beads gently, her breath catching. "It's beautiful. It belongs to someone who remembers the wind," he said softly. She met his gaze, her throat too tight for words. When he rode away that evening, the desert swallowed the sound of his horse's hooves, but the whisper of change he'd brought to Red Mesa remained, woven into every quiet moment, every kinder glance, every breath of wind that carried both their names. Night had fallen over Red Mesa, and the desert lay wrapped in silver light. The wind was soft, carrying with it the scent of mesquite smoke and rain far off in the distance. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Clara May stood outside her small ranch house. The turquoise necklace Taza had given her resting against her throat. The beads were cool and smooth beneath her fingers, glowing faintly in the moonlight. She had worn it every day since he left. Each evening, she found herself looking toward the north, where the horizon met the dark outline of the mountains. She never said it aloud, not even to herself, but she always hoped to see the faint silhouette of a rider against the starlit ridge. That night, her hope was answered. At first, it was only a shape in the distance, a whisper of motion between the shadows. Then the faint glint of metal caught the moonlight, and she knew before she could breathe his name. "Taza," she murmured. He rode toward her slowly, his horse's gait easy and sure. Dust rose around him like pale smoke, glowing white beneath the stars. When he finally reached the fence, he dismounted and gave a soft word to the mare before stepping forward. "You came back," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I said I would," he replied. "The road north was long, but I remembered the wind." Clara smiled faintly. "You always speak like the earth is listening." "Maybe it is," he said. For a while they simply stood there, the silence between them full of all the things that didn't need to be said. The desert stretched wide and endless around them, but somehow it didn't feel empty. He looked at her, at the necklace shining softly against her collarbone. "You kept it." "Of course," she said. "It reminds me to be brave." Taza's gaze softened, and he stepped closer. "You were brave long before I gave it to you." She looked down, smiling. "Maybe, but it helps to have something to hold on to." He reached out then, his hand brushing against the turquoise beads. His fingers lingered for just a heartbeat long enough for her pulse to catch. "I brought you something," she said suddenly, her voice trembling with quiet courage. From the porch, she lifted a folded bundle of dark wool, the same coat he had given her that day in the square. It was clean now, carefully mended along one sleeve. "You said it belonged where it was given," she said, "but I think it belongs to both of us." Taza looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Then we will share it." He took the coat from her hands, unfolded it, and just as he had done before, placed it gently over her shoulders. The gesture was slower this time, deliberate, as though it carried more than warmth. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it settle around her, the familiar scent of cedar and sun, the quiet promise it carried. When she opened them again, he was still standing close, the stars reflected in his eyes. "Clara May," he said softly, "the world you live in is not kind to people who stand beside me." "I know," she said, "but it's kinder than it was before." He studied her face, searching for hesitation, but found none. What he saw instead was the same strength he'd seen that first day in the square, the strength that had drawn him to her. Quiet but unbreakable. "Then I will stand beside you," he said simply. For a moment, neither of them moved. The desert wind stirred the hem of the coat, lifting it like a banner. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a long, haunting sound that rose and fell beneath the vast, star-choked sky. Clara smiled, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You always make things sound like forever." Taza looked toward the horizon, then back at her. "Some things are." They stood together beneath the stars, the coat wrapped around them both, the desert stretching silent and endless around them. The same ground that had witnessed cruelty now bore witness to something far different, something gentler, truer, stronger. For the first time in her life, Clara May felt no shame, no fear, only belonging. And as the night deepened, the coat that once covered her humiliation now became a symbol of something greater, of forgiveness, of courage, and of love born quietly in the heart of the desert. When dawn came, the first light found them still standing together, facing the horizon. Two figures bound not by pity or pride, but by something eternal and wordless. Like the wind itself, the people of Red Mesa would tell many versions of their story in the years that followed. But the truth, the real truth, was simpler than all the rest. They laughed once. He covered her once. And love, silent and steadfast, did the rest.